James Yee served as a U.S. Army Muslim chaplain for the military prison camp in Guantanamo Bay in 2003. A graduate of West Point, Captain Yee objected to the abuse of Guantanamo prisoners. Subsequently, after a very public and high-profile arrest, he was imprisoned for 76 days in solitary confinement and falsely accused of aiding the terrorist enemy. Months after government investigations led to all criminal charges being dropped, in January 2005, Chaplain Yee tendered his resignation from the U.S. Army and received an honorable discharge. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to present to you Captain James Yee.
Thank you very much. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here today for this Veterans for Peace conference. And I want to tell you that one of the first things that I did when I got here yesterday was to get one of those orange ribbons and put it on my name tag. So for those of you who don't have one, please get one. I'm very enthused to see that Guantanamo is being talked about at almost every session here of this convention. But CloseGitmo.net has 2.7 million of these ribbons to give out. Why 2.7 million? Because 2.7 million is the cost of dollars that it takes to house one prisoner at Guantanamo for a year. $2.7 million. We heard a little bit earlier someone talking about the costs of war, but let's talk about the cost of war. We know about death and destruction, the lives lost, to injuries, the money that goes into militarization, the toll that it takes on the environment. We heard about the cost of war of civil liberties, the damage to our nation's reputation. These are all part of the cost of war. But let's look at the cost of war of just Guantanamo Bay, where I served in 2003 as the chaplain assigned to the prison camp. 2.7 million to house one prisoner for a year. That equates to $450 million per year. Since its inception in 2002, our nation has spent $4.7 billion to run this place called Guantanamo Bay prison camp. What's the cost to the taxpayer? $1.2 million per day. $1.2 million per day is spent to run Guantanamo Bay. And in this day and age, when we have what people are calling an economic crisis, somehow our country still finds money to torture people. Torture. The treatment in Guantanamo Bay has been called tantamount to torture by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Guantanamo Bay has been called the gulag of our time by Amnesty International. It's been called a legal black hole by major newspaper editorials. And world leaders across the globe have denounced Gitmo as a betrayal of human rights and the rule of law. Let's look at Gitmo by the numbers. Gitmo has housed 779 prisoners in this so-called war on terror. 604 of those prisoners have been transferred out under both the Bush and Obama administration, mostly under the Bush administration. Today, there are still 166 prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. 86 of those 166 are cleared for release and have been cleared for release for the last 3 years, but they're still in Guantanamo Bay. 46 of those prisoners, our government says, will not be charged, but they're too dangerous to be released. Those 46, our government intends to keep them there indefinitely without charge. Only 10 prisoners at Guantanamo Bay have either been convicted of some offense or actually have been levied charges. 9 prisoners have died at Guantanamo Bay. And that number 9 is more than the number of people who have actually been convicted of any offense at Guantanamo Bay. Interestingly enough, of all those who have been held in Guantanamo Bay, it included even five individuals who had been imprisoned by the Taliban as spies. The Taliban had imprisoned them as spies, and then they became prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, held by the U.S. government and U.S. military. That's Gitmo by the numbers. Let's talk more about torture and how I might define Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay, in my eyes, is defined as the following: caged cells where prisoners are treated more like animals than human beings. Prolonged solitary confinement, sometimes the denial of sunlight, sleep deprivation, environmental manipulation, being subjected to freezing cold temperatures and unbearable hot temperatures, brutal beatings by guards, especially during what's called in Guantanamo forced cell extractions, down in Guantanamo known as earthings, operations carried out by the immediate reaction force to forcibly extract a prisoner from a cell when he refuses to do so. Bruises and broken teeth, prisoners being dragged through the gravel of Guantanamo Bay, sensory deprivation, being chained, shackled, hooded, sexual humiliation, and now hunger strike, being forcefully fed to be kept alive by those prisoners today who are in the news because of the hunger strike that they started 6 months ago. We're 6 months now into a hunger strike which last month reached a peak number of 106. 46 of those were being force-fed by the U.S. military to be kept alive. Today, there's still about 60 of those prisoners still on that hunger strike, with maybe about 40 still being force-fed. So of those who came off of the hunger strike over the last month, probably due to the holy month of Ramadan, which just ended 2 days ago, still the number of those being force-fed is still maintained around 40. Now, what is this force-feeding? Down in Guantanamo, when I was there in 2003, I actually observed prisoners being force-fed. There were 2 prisoners who were being force-fed daily. Not because at that time they were on hunger strike, but because they were so depressed. Mentally, their mental health deteriorated to a point where these 2 individuals could no longer eat. They had no appetite. They refused to take solid food. Their bodies deteriorated to less than 100 pounds. Those 2 individuals were being force-fed in the detainee hospital down at Guantanamo. And I saw how it was done. They didn't have those chairs where you get strapped into at that time. The prisoner instead was strapped into that hospital bed, handcuffed, each hand to the bed. A Navy corpsman, a nurse perhaps, holding the forehead back, as another medical personnel would take this long plastic tube, even put some petroleum jelly or some other type of lubricant on it, and jam it into the nostril of that prisoner and go into the stomach. And every time that happened, the prisoner would yell out a scream, a yell of pain, because it was torturous. But the military today says no. This is a humane process, a process that even some of the prisoners asked to have done to them, right? Because they're on hunger strike. You're not getting the full story. This force feeding, what is it? In my mind, you might even call it sodomy. Forcibly inserting an object into an orifice of the human body. The World Medical Association says that force-feeding a prisoner to keep one alive on a hunger strike is against all ethics. Force-feeding has been criticized by the president of the American Medical Association. But this is what's going on in Guantanamo today. I talked about some of those things that do go on in Guantanamo, or have gone on in Guantanamo. The abuses, the punishment, the torture, the horrible conditions. And as the chaplain in Guantanamo, I raised some objections, some concerns to the command of what we were doing in Guantanamo. Merely posing that question at times of whether what we were doing down there was right. And what did that land me when I did that? That landed me in prison. Because all of a sudden I then became a suspect, a target, the Muslim chaplain at Guantanamo. And somehow, on my way out of Guantanamo, when I landed back on U.S. soil in Florida, I was then arrested in secret by the military, interrogated by the FBI, and placed in solitary confinement for 76 days in a facility known as the Consolidated Naval Break in Charleston, South Carolina. Why Charleston, South Carolina at the Consolidated Naval Break? Because that's where they housed at the time under the Bush administration what they termed U.S. citizen enemy combatants. The foreign enemy combatants we know were down in Guantanamo Bay and in the other secret CIA black sites. But if you were a U.S. citizen or had been taken into custody on U.S. soil, then you were brought to the Consolidated Naval Break in Charleston, South Carolina. And that's where they placed me. Next to other prisoners, like Jose Padilla, Yasser Hamdi, Salah El-Mari. James Yee was in that prison. And when I was transferred to that prison from Jacksonville, I also was subjected to sensory deprivation. Having those blackened out goggles put over my eyes, those ear devices like earmuffs put over my ears to prevent me from hearing. I was shackled in a suit of chains at the wrist, at the waist, the ankles, in the same manner that they shackle prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. I understood the way I was being treated was meant to tell me that I was being accused of terrorism. There was fear inside me. I didn't know if I was going to live or die, or where I was being taken, or whether I would even be seen again. My family had no idea where I was taken. But they learned a few weeks later, when they saw me on the television, on the news, when media leaks by the government exposed that I was being held in Charleston, South Carolina. That's how my family learned of where I was, from the media. To make a very long and harrowing story short, after I was investigated top and bottom and accused of being a spy, of espionage, of aiding the enemy, and of being threatened with the death penalty, all of the accusations that were brought against me were dropped. I was released from prison. And even the military continued to try me on what they called mishandling classified information. But there was no classified information that I mishandled. So even those charges would disappear. I was released, sent back to Fort Lewis, where I was stationed, reinstated as a chaplain, assigned to the Fort Lewis installation chaplain. How long do you think it took me to tender my resignation from the U.S. Army? A few months later, I tendered my resignation, and I received an honorable discharge. And when I left the U.S. military, I also received a second U.S. Army Commendation Medal for exceptionally meritorious service. Figure that one out. But I'll tell you, I miss being in the military. I miss being able to educate others about my faith, Islam. I miss challenging commanders as to whether or not what they're deciding to do is ethical or moral, as was my duty according to Army doctrine. When I was sent back to Fort Lewis, I was gagged by my battalion commander, saying that if I spoke out about how I was treated, if I criticized the Department of Defense, if I criticized the Department of the Army, I would be back under charges of the UCMJ. And we heard earlier Michael McPherson say that one of the most important tools that we have as advocates of peace is our voice. So I ask today, as I conclude my short talk, that all of you make that commitment to keep raising your voice. And as I ask you to make that commitment, I take off my shirt and show that I have this t-shirt underneath that says, "We will not be silent." About advocating for the closure of Guantanamo, and we all won't be silent for advocating for peace. My name is James Yee. I'm the former U.S. Army Muslim chaplain at Guantanamo. It's an honor and pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you very much.